Okay, so as we continue on, and again, this shir is sponsored in memory of Chana Devora Bas Avram. We have been going through the story of Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, hiding from the Romans in a cave for 12 years. And so Gemara then says, Azlu, they went Tashu b'ma'arta, and they hid themselves in a cave. Israchash Nisa, a miracle occurred. Ivruluhu charuva, and a carob tree was created for them. Ve'ena demaya, and a spring of water. So some of the commentators over here raise some interesting halachic questions regarding this carob tree that miraculously grew for them. Because in the Torah, there is halacha called orla. What orla means is that when you plant a new tree, and although most agricultural laws only apply, well, in Eretz Yisrael, this one applies even outside of Eretz Yisrael. Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai was in Israel. I'm just mentioning that because for those of us listening should be aware that this is something that we should be strict about outside of Israel. Also, for the first 3 years, we do not eat from the fruit of the tree. And the fruit of those years is referred to as arla. And in that case, how is it that Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai and his son started eating from this carob tree? It should have been literally forbidden fruit to them for the first 3 years after it started to grow. So there are a number of answers given among the commentators, and I will share a couple of them with you. One answer is that the concept of orla, of having to learn patience and waiting before eating fruit, that is a mitzvah that was given in response to the sin of Adam HaRishon. That when Adam and Chava ate from the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge, the sin was the fact that they ate from the tree before it was time to eat from the tree. And they were created on Friday afternoon, and they ate from the tree on Friday afternoon. And had they waited until Shabbos to partake of the tree, then everything would have been fine. And therefore, the Torah gave us a mitzvah of arla, sort of like to learn patience, not to do the same thing as Adam HaRishon and to grab fruit before it's time. And therefore, the Sefer Kerem Ephraim wants to explain that Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, they were living a life, and we'll discuss this a little bit more later on also, akin to that of Adam HaRishon, of Adam, before the sin. And that's why we'll discuss in a few minutes why they weren't wearing clothing. But because of the fact that spiritually they had managed to develop themselves to the level of Adam prior to the sin, therefore they were not under the stricture of being prohibited from eating arla, the new fruit, because they did not have to rectify the sin of Adam, as they had moved above and beyond that sin and its consequences. Another answer brought down by a number of the commentators is that the Gemara had mentioned explicitly that this tree was created miraculously. Exactly what that means, that was created miraculously, frankly, I'm not sure. But either which way, they say that the halacha of orla, of not eating the fruit from the first 3 years, that's of a naturally growing tree. but a tree which is created in a way that is a miracle, that is not subject to this halacha. And there are actually other areas also where we're taught that if something comes by means of a miracle, the halachic applications of that thing are different. The Ben Ish Chai has a sefer Rav Pa'olim, which is a book of responsa. And interestingly, while as most books of responsa are, it is primarily a work responding to halachic inquiries, but in the back of each volume, there are a number of inquiries about certain Kabbalistic concepts. But anyway, someone has sent him a question that the Zohar states that Rebbe Shimon ben Yochai said that he was always very strict to eat 3 meals every single Shabbos. And in that case, how was he able to fulfill the requirement of eating 3 meals while he was in the cave? Because technically, from a halachic standpoint, in order to qualify as a meal, it has to involve bread. And if all Rebbe Shimon bar Yochai and his son had were carobs and a stream of water, where was the bread? And how could Rebbe Shimon bar Yochai testify upon himself that he always fulfilled the concept of having 3 meals on Shabbos? For that matter, the person had, what did Rebbe Shimon bar Yochai do every year on Pesach? We know on Pesach there's a mitzvah to eat matzah, to eat maror. So what did Rebbe Shimon bar Yochai do in the absence of matzah and maror every single Pesach? So the Ben Ish Chai offered 2 answers to this question. First, he said that since Rebbe Shimon bar Yochai and his son, their lives were in danger, and that's why they had to hide out in the cave. So in a case of pikuach nefesh, when someone's life is in danger, they're exempt from performing other mitzvos. And therefore, indeed, during the period of time, the 13 years that Rebbe Shimon bar Yochai and his son spent in the cave, they did not have 3 meals on Shabbos, they didn't eat matzah, they didn't eat maror, but they were exempt from it because of the fact that their life was in danger. And even though, yes, Rebbe Shimon bar Yochai said in the Zohar that he always fulfilled it, he meant when he had the opportunity, he always fulfilled it. But obviously, so to speak, when he was in the cave, he was unable to fulfill it, but he was also not obligated to do that mitzvah. A second possible answer that the Ben Ish Chai offers is that the Zohar says elsewhere that the study of Torah can replace the Shabbos meals. And therefore, rather than fulfilling his obligation to have a meal by having bread and wine, instead he had his Shabbos meals through the study of Torah. And I will just add that there are quite a number of places in which both bread and wine are used by the sages as metaphors for Torah study. He says they did the same thing when it came to matzah and lulav, that even though they could obviously not eat matzah, they didn't have any lulav available for them to take, but because of the fact that they wanted to go ahead and to do those mitzvos, that counted for them as if they did it. I'm wondering if we can't maybe take a slightly different twist on this idea that he's saying, and that is that we find elsewhere that, for example, the Gemara tells us that nowadays, in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash, and we don't have the opportunity to bring the korbanos, the sacrifices, we can replace the bringing of the sacrifices by studying the relevant Torah portions that discuss those sacrifices. So I'm wondering if one can possibly suggest that when it came to eating matzah or maror or taking of lulav, so perhaps in the absence of the opportunity or the possibility of fulfilling those mitzvos, Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai and his son fulfilled them by the study of those topics instead. The Gemara goes on, and it said, "V'havu mishalchi manayu," that they had removed their clothing. V'havu yasvi, and they were sitting ad tzavarayu, up until their necks, bechala, in sand. Kuliyomi garsi, all day long they were studying. Be'idan tzluyi, when it was time to daven, when it was time to pray. Lovshu michsu, they got dressed and covered. Umatzlu, and they davened. Vahadur mishalchi manayu, and then they took their clothing off again. Kihechi delo livlu, in order that their clothing should not wear out. So this fascinating idea over here that they spent most of their day not actually wearing clothing, but covered up in sand. Interestingly, it's brought down in Sfarim from a couple of hundred years ago that people in Eretz Yisrael had a custom to burn clothing on Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer, is again the yard site of Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai. And there's, of course, all sorts of celebrations that go on. And apparently in Eretz Yisrael, the minhag in those days was to burn clothing. And actually, the Shilos Uchuvos Shoel Umeshiv comes out very strongly against that it's wrong to be destroying good clothing with no purpose. And he says, I promise them that if rather than destroying their clothing, they would take the value of that clothing and give it for tzedakah, that would make Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai much, much happier than when they're going ahead and burning their clothing. But the Sefer Yeshuos Malko wants to explain that where does this custom of burning the clothing come from? He says because prior to the sin, Adam and Chava were naked, as the pasuk said explicitly. And it was only in consequence of the sin that they had to put on clothing. And Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, the reason why they spent most of their time without clothing was, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, to symbolize this idea that they had managed to develop themselves to a point of being akin to the state of Adam prior to the sin. Okay, I think we are going to stop over here, and we will continue Mirz Hashem. I know in the little blurb I put down, there was more, but that's going to have to wait in Mirz Hashem for our next discussion, hopefully on Thursday. Have a very good evening.